Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Menchet. Today's daf is sponsored by Julia Martin Mendelson in honor of their first granddaughter. She's the first grandchild and first great-grandchild in our family, and she changed everyone's status in an instant. We thank God for her safe delivery and pray that He grants her and her parents abundant health, blessings, success, and peace, along with all of Am Yisrael. Today's daf is sponsored by Rachel Savin in loving memory of Shalom ben Shmuel on his 4th yahrzeit. We're going to get started with the end where we ended yesterday, in the middle of a debate between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan. So we have a debate about let's just review this pasuk because we saw a whole bunch of things from it. Today we'll also kind of bring everything together. Vayikra bet Yud Aleph and Yud bet. All mincha, right? We had a whole drasha on what mincha is coming to include. Asher takrivu Hashem lo te'aseh chametz. Okay, don't make it chametz, don't let it leaven. Ki kol seor v'chol dvash lo taktir b'menu yishal Hashem. Now, we learned a lot of things with these words. Today we're going to learn even more, okay? But basically, the simple of what we learned so far is any leavened item or any honey, which, by the way, doesn't all mean honey from bees, but it means honey from fruits. That's what we talked about. The korban reshit is the bikkurim, which are the fruits that are sweet. So anything sweet, really, we would call it. Lo taktiru mimenu ishal Hashem, which sounds like don't burn it on the altar, but we derive from it also that in addition it means anything that was ktar mimenu, that something from it already went leishim on the fire. The rest of it, which is supposed to be given to the kohen usually, or to the owners, let's say, like meat of shlamim, you cannot burn that on the fire either. So there was an additional negative prohibition here besides no seor, no dvash. Also, don't burn anything where part of it was already burned on the altar. The rest of it is not allowed to be, and if you burn it, you're going to transgress this negative prohibition. Then the next pasuk said, so there's two things going on here, and that's exactly where we ended yesterday with this play between the two things. The next pasuk says, what can you bring to the Beit HaMikdash that's chametz? Or dvash, korban reshit takrivot Hashem, your first korban of the year, which really isn't your first korban of the year. It means the first korban from the new crop, okay, other than the mincha omer, which is from the new crop of the barley, but the first one is from the new crop of the wheat, and the first fruits that you're bringing, which both happen on Shavuot, those can be brought to Hashem, takrivu otam Hashem. Notice the rabbim, we're going to get back to this, takrivu is plural. You can bring these to God. Ve'el hamizbeach lo yalu l'reach nichach. But you cannot bring these things on the altar, the reach nichach. Okay, again, we seem to be saying don't bring these on the altar. Now, what we saw at the very end of yesterday's daf was this drasha, lo ya'alu. Why does it say lo ya'alu? Or at least that was one way of reading it. It's the drasha, lo ya'alu, comes to include the ramp. Even putting it on the ramp is a problem. Now, putting what on the ramp? So the first explanation was Rabbi Elazar, it was Rabbi Yochanan, who said, all of the things of the previous pasuk, seor, dvash, or the items that we're talking about, which is if you took some of it, burned it on the altar, the rest of it, you then brought to the ramp, Rabbi Yochanan says you're chayav on that as well. Comes Rabbi Elazar and he says, no, it says, korban reshit takrivu otam. What are we talking about otam? We're not talking about parts that were burned and the rest of it. We're talking about just the seor and dvash. So the otam, when it says takrivu otam, these, we're already limiting this second pasuk where it does include the ramp. He agrees that lo ya'alu includes the ramp, but it only includes the ramp for the first prohibition of the seor and the dvash. Doesn't include the ramp for this law of kol shemimenu leishim. Whatever from there went to the fire, the rest of it is forbidden. The ramp is not included, so you'll be exempt. Okay, it doesn't necessarily say go bring it up there, but he does say you'll be exempt. Okay, and Rabbi Yochanan says you're going to be chayav. So now, and his whole drasha is really based on this word otam. Specifically those, that comes to be a limiting word. So now the obvious question is, starting from the top of our daf, Rabbi Yochanan, hay otam hayavale. What does Rabbi Yochanan do with the word otam? Well, he needs this for the following braita. Okay, now we're going to have a braita. The first drasha is going to be from the word takrivu. The second drasha is going to be from the word otam. I'm going to read the pasuk again. Korban reshit, bring these as your first korban. Takrivu otam laHashem. You can offer these to God. So we're going to darshan takrivu, we're going to darshan otam. So the second part in the braita is what's important because we're looking for the word otam. What does Rabbi Yochanan do with it? And we'll say, he must hold by this drasha that we found in this braita. So the the basic premise of this braita is, now there's a korban shtei lechem where you're allowed to bring chametz in that one unique case. What if I decide I want to bring a korban shtei lechem as a nidava, as a voluntary offering? Am I allowed to? And it's once we have this concept of a shtei lechem korban, maybe I could bring it as a voluntary offering. First, we're going to see as an individual, then we're going to see maybe as a community we could bring it as a voluntary offering. And obviously both are going to be rejected. Maybe you could think an individual can offer, the first part is the individual, can offer to bring this as a voluntary offering. And if, let's say, I say, I'm going to voluntarily bring to the, harei alai, I'm taking upon myself to bring a korban shtei lechem, maybe I would have to, because korei ba, the pasuk says, motza svatecha tishmor v'asita. Whatever you say, you have to do. So if I said it, I have to do it. Talmud lomar, that's why the pasuk says, korban reshit takrivu, in plural. What does plural mean? Only as a community, not as an individual. Tzibor amarti lecha v'lo yachid. Said community, I didn't say individual. Okay, that's the first stage. So they say, fine, I get that. Yachol lo yehe yachid mevi she'eno mevi chavato kayotze ba. Aval yehe tzibor mevi. Okay, so I could get maybe that the individual doesn't bring. Why? Because there's no parallel individual korban. Okay, we're now going to compare communal to individual and obligatory to voluntary. Now, when there's no obligation ever for an individual to bring a shtei lechem, which has chametz in it, that's the whole problem. Well, right, there's one time where we're going to allow it. We're not going to allow it for an individual. Maybe because there's no parallel in the world of obligatory. For an individual, there's no obligation ever to bring a shtei lechem. So therefore, if I bring it as a nedava, well, we're not going to say I'm allowed to do that because there is no parallel. But in the obligatory sphere. But ulai aval yehet tzibur maybe the community though can voluntarily offer to bring a shtei lechem shemevi chavato kayotze ba, because there's a parallel in the world of obligations for the community, because the community is obligated once a year to bring this korban shtei lechem. Maybe you would think that more likely we would say that the community could voluntarily bring this offering. Talmud lomar otam, that was what we were looking for the whole time. The word otam. Korban reshit taklivu otam. These meaning only the ones that were specified in the Torah as obligations. Okay? And therefore, ma yesh lecha lavi, shtei lechem min ha'seor, bikkurim min hadvash. The only things you can bring are the shtei lechem, which comes from seor, and the bikkurim from the dvash, and that's it. Nothing else. Only where you're commanded, no voluntary offerings, not for individuals, not for the community. Okay, so Otam came to say, only these are to be brought, no community, right? You can't bring as a communal offering a voluntary shtei lechem. That's what it's coming to say. Okay, so now the Gemara, so that's the end. We kind of finished. Okay, we had this machloket, Rabbi Elazar and the rabbis. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan. Are you liable if you bring them on the ramp? The whole issue that led us to this sugya was Rabbi Elazar learned his opinion from the word otam. That otam comes to be limiting all those other things. Kol shemimenu lishim. You're not liable if you put them on the ramp. Only the other ones. What does Rabbi Yochanan do with otam? Completely different halacha. He says this permission to bring the shtei lechem is only for the obligatory offering, not for any voluntary offering, even by the community. Now the Gemara is going to question this assumption that we just made in this braita. Wait, the community can't bring them as voluntary offerings? And now we're going to suggest, it seems like, if you read this next braita, the possible reading, or simple reading, or a more obvious reading, would be that shtei lechem, the community could bring as a voluntary offering. Okay, we're going to have to see how they get there. V'hatanya, doesn't it say in a braita? So this is just the conclusion reached in the previous braita. They're now questioning. And really the drasha otam, which seemed to say this community can't bring it as a voluntary offering. So doesn't it say in a braita? Im ne'emar kol seor, lama ne'emar kol dvash. V'im ne'emar kol dvash, lama ne'emar kol seor. Okay, this is a drasha we're going to see later in today's daf, which could come up in a completely different context. But the pasuk says, all seor, all dvash. Okay, we didn't focus on those words yet. Okay, that's what we're going to focus on today. Ki kol seor v'chol dvash lo taktiru mimenu ishel Hashem. Now the word kol we're going to see later includes even less than the regular requisite amount. Pachot mishiur. Okay, we're going to see what that is. But right now, that's not of interest to us right now. What is interest to us is the fact that the pasuk says, it should have just said kol se'or udvash. Why does it say kol se'or v'chol dvash? All the se'or, all the dvash. We're assuming the word kol is coming to include something more than usual. But once we have it by the leaven, the word leaven, why don't we have it by the word, why do we need it also by the word honey? Okay, it's enough to have it by one and we can learn from one to the other. And that's going to be the focus of this braita, is going to be why can't we learn one from the other? How are they different from each other in general? What's our rule? If one is more stringent than the other, then you could say that's why kol is there to include even less than a shear, right? But you wouldn't necessarily be able to learn it to the case where it's more lenient. Okay, so now they're going to say like this. Each one has unique things about it that is not found in the other one. Okay, se'or hutar michlalo b'mikdash. So se'or has a heter to bring it in the mikdash, which right now they think means you can bring leaven on the altar in a particular situation. We're going to get to that soon, what that means. That's going to be the key line for us right now, but we don't yet know how. Dvash lo hutar michlalo b'mikdash. You can never bring dvash on the altar, okay? Never bring it to the mikdash. Dvash hutar b'sheyarei menachot, se'or lo hutar b'sheyarei menachot. Now, okay, one was, what is more severe about dvash? Because dvash doesn't have this special dispensation, which we don't yet exactly know what it is, that leaven has. And now we're going to say, and leaven doesn't have this special leniency that dvash has. What's the leniency about dvash? Remember what happens with the mincha. We take the mincha, we have the whole dough, we take the kohen takes the chametz out, burns it on the altar, the rest is given to the kohanim to eat. Now they can eat it with honey if they want. How do we know that? Because it says that all the gifts to the kohanim are given lemoshcha, which is like mishicha, like a king. It's given to eat like kings, and basically they can dip it in honey if they want. Okay, they can eat it any way they want. There's no prohibition for the kohen to eat the remainder with honey. But masha'en came b'se'or, but they can't leaven the even after the chametz is taken. The shirayim also can't be leavened. We learned that. So we see that there's a certain stringency about se'or that isn't in dvash. And therefore, hu'tzrach lomar kol se'or v'utzrach lomar kol dvash. Okay, and that's why you needed both, because you couldn't have learned one from the other. Now, let's try to understand what they were talking about and what does it mean se'or hutar michalo b'mikdash. Se'or shutar michalo b'mikdash ma'iniu. Lav shte alechem dekarva nedava. Is it not? When is it permitted to bring se'or on the altar? Now the assumption is that what they mean is hutar michalo, it's permitted to go b'mikdash, it's permitted to go on the altar. Now what happens with the shtei alechem? The shtei alechem is given to the kohanim completely. None of it is burned on the altar. So what are they assuming here? There must be a case where there's a heter to bring leavening, something leavened, on the altar. What would that be? Well, if as a community, not on Shavuot, we decide we're going to offer a shtei alechem offering, then perhaps they're assuming that must be the offering that's offered on the altar. The part of it gets burned, maybe in part given to the kohanim. Maybe it would be like a regular mincha, or maybe the whole thing gets burned. So they're assuming, okay, Rashi says, Lav d'shtei alechem dekarva nedava b'mizbeach. Okay, it must be that those are brought on the mizbeach, at least part of it. If we're talking about the obligatory ones, lo matzah l'meimar, da lo tar b'mikdash. These weren't permitted or b'mizbeach, de lo karev l'mizbeach. They're not offered on the altar, as I said before. So Rashi says this explicitly, what I explained before, that's where I got it from, that it's obvious to them that we must be talking about that it's burned on the altar. And if it's burned on the altar, we know it's not the shtei alechem that we have. So what other case? There is no other case where the leaven is actually burned on the altar. So it must be that there's something called the shtei alechem nidava offering of the community. We're going to assume if there is one, it's community and not individual, as we saw before. But the community part, which was the second part, like they don't disagree with the first part of the original braita that we saw this in the beginning of Daf, but they disagree with the second one, and this seems to say, again, this is the way to read the braita, that they must be talking about the offering of shtei alechem that's a nedava, that must be the community nedava offering, and that contradicts what we said in the braita, what Otam comes to limit. To which Amarav Amram, lo likarev imahem. He says, no. It doesn't mean these are actually offered on the altar, that seor is permitted on the altar. No. Seor is permitted to go together with something that is burned on the altar. What is that? The sheep. Remember, you do the 2 sheep with the 2 loaves. The 2 sheep get burned on the altar. The 2 loaves go to the Kohen. This is considered the seor hutar michalo b'mikdash. It's as if the seor was permitted on the altar, even though it itself doesn't go on the altar. It goes along with something that was burned on the altar, which is the parts of the meat that get burned on the altar. So now we're going to say, this is just talking about the regular obligatory offering. It's not talking at all about a voluntary offering that the community brings and then the leaven is actually offered on the altar. No, the leaven is not offered on the altar, and there is no such thing as a voluntary shtei halechem. It's only that one time a year that the Torah says you can bring the shtei halechem. That's the one time a year on Shavuot as a communal offering, as an obligatory offering. And yes, it's true, it doesn't actually go on the altar, but it goes with meat that is, parts of it are burned on the altar. And that's what they mean. Now, let's just check one last thing here. The braita now is saying, okay, to go back and reread the braita. Seor is hutar michlalo, because seor is allowed to be brought with an offering that's burned on the altar, and bikkurim are not, right? Devash is never allowed to be brought with something burned on the altar, right? That would be the assumption of how we would read this line in the braita. Well, ihachi bikkurim nami. They say, if Rav Amram, you're going to explain that it's to go with something that's offered on the altar, even though they themselves aren't offered on the altar, the bikkurim are also brought with something offered on the altar. I don't know if you knew this, but okay, ditnan in the Mishnah in bikkurim. Okay, the Mishnah in bikkurim, by the way, just to mention, it's one of those Mishnayot that are explanatory. They explain a situation, like what would the people do when they brought bikkurim, and it goes through all the details. Okay, it's very similar. You might remember from Arvei Psachim. The last chapter in Psachim is all about the Leil HaSeder, but it doesn't say this is what you're supposed to do, right? It describes it as it's going on. Okay, samach lemincha, they wouldn't eat, and then they pour him the first cup, and then they ask the questions, and then they describe what went on, like the experiential element of it. So the bikkurim is like that also, and in the description of bringing the bikkurim, it says, "Hagozalot she'al gabei hasalin hayu olot, hasalim shebiyadam nitanim l'kohanim." Basically, they would bring baskets full of fruits, and there would be birds with them in the baskets. And what they would do is, like sitting on the baskets or something, what they would do is they would bring this to the temple. Okay, the fruits are obviously the bikkurim. Okay, they don't discuss here what they do with the bikkurim, but what they mentioned here is the birds would be offered up as olot. So what do you see here? Okay, and then the baskets go to the kohanim as gifts. Okay, but the point being that here in the bikkurim, you also have animals, or birds in this case, being offered together with the bikkurim. So it's no different than the shtei halechem with the 2 kvasim, with the 2 sheep. So they say, no, it's completely different. That doesn't mean bikkurim are permitted to be brought with something that's brought on the altar, because hanula atir bikkurim mudatu. Okay, and that's why maybe I wanted to point out that this is a descriptive mission of what they would do. They would decorate, they would put birds, they would carry birds with them on their baskets to make it look prettier, okay? How they got the birds to stay, I don't know, but putting that point aside, the point is that this was just an added nice decorative thing, and if already they got to the temple with the birds, they would basically slaughter them as korbanot olav. It's not that it was an essential part of the mitzvah, like the kifsei atzeret, it says in the Torah, they go with the bread, or the bread goes with them, and obviously they're one part of one sacrifice. The birds here that are brought as korbanot olah are not integrally connected at all to the bikkurim. They're just there for decorative purposes, and that's why I said it's a descriptive Mishnah, because I'm sure not everybody brought them with birds, and it was sort of just, if you brought the birds, then we should sacrifice them as korbanot olah. It would be nice, but it's not part and parcel of the bikkurim process. Okay, so all we did so far, if we talk about the structure, was really here to darshan this word of tam. What does Rabbi Yochanan do with them? From that, we said he limits korban sibur of voluntary shtei halechem. We brought a braita that seemed to say there is such a thing, and then we said, no, you misunderstood. The braita is not talking about anything that the shtei halechem isn't burned on the altar and some voluntary offering. It's just brought with meat that's burned on the altar. Okay. Now we go back to our issue about the halacha, I'm going to say it in the words of the Gemara there, kol shemimenu liishim, anything that from this, right, that second part of the pasuk, lo taktir mimenu ishel Hashem, which we darshan to say, not just are we talking about seor and dvash in this pasuk that can't go on the altar, but you also can't put on the altar anything that part of it was burned. And it seemed very clear that's the way we're understanding this pasuk. But now we're going to raise a question about that. By Rami Bar Chama Rav Chisda. Let's just talk about what we included in this category previously. We had anything like the shirayim, where part of it was burned and the rest is left, something like that. We had the basar of kodesh kodshim and kodshim kalim, which the imurim are burnt, but the meat gets eaten. We had some exceptions to the rule, like the shtei alechem and the lechem apanim, which actually none of them go on the altar, but we said something with it goes on the altar, which is just like we were saying now, right? The kvasim and the lavona for the lechem apanim, so there's something that gets burned with it. Now what about a chatat ha'of? What happens with a chatat ha'of? Let's try to remember. Chatat ha'of, you put the blood on the altar, and the rest of the bird, nothing gets burnt. There's no imurim or fatty parts. It's not an animal. And it's not an ola where the whole thing gets burnt. So what do we do with the whole bird after we slaughter, after we do malika and then do the blood? The rest of it goes to the Kohen. So nothing of it gets burned on the altar. So you would automatically think that this is not part of the prohibition. What if I burned it on the altar? Would I be liable? No. Why wouldn't I be liable? Because this isn't a case of kol shemimenu liishim, right? The pasuk specifically say lo taktir mimenu ishe, fire. So from there they darshan, if something mimenu, right, they took the psukim, like kind of mixed up the order of the words in the psukim, kol shemimenu liishim, if you already took something and burned it on the fire from this whole item, and the rest was not supposed to go on the fire, if you burn it, you're going to be liable. But comes Rami Bar Chama and he says, maybe just this includes anything, well not anything, but anything that was a korban, we're going to see. It was a sacrifice, or called a korban, that was not designated for burning on the altar, and you burn it on the altar, maybe you're chayav. So that's what he says. Kol shemimenu liishim amar Rachmana, do we say it's anything that from there went on the fire, and nothing here went on the fire, v'hai ein mimenu liishim, and therefore you won't be chayav. O dilma kol sheshmo korban. Now, maybe anything called a korban. Why does he think korban? Because what does the pasuk say? Don't bring sword, don't bring dvash, don't burn these other things on the altar. What can you burn? Korban reshit takrivu otam, right? You can bring a korban reshit that's or dvash, right? That's the bikkurim and the shtei alechem. So now they say maybe anything, because it says korban here, maybe the previous pasuk is relating to anything that's called a korban. Korban, and a chatat ha'of is a korban, and it's not meant for the altar. Obviously, right? It would have to be both a korban and not designated for the altar, because if it's designated for the altar, obviously you're supposed to burn it on the altar. We're talking about a prohibition that's not supposed to go on the altar, right? Prohibition to bring something on the altar. So what is Rav Chisda's answer? Surprisingly, Amarle kol sheshmo korban. Right? Until now, if we learned this sugya, we would have thought it was only things that get burned. Now we're going to say, no, anything called a korban that's not supposed to be burned on the altar, you burn it on the altar, you're chayav, okay? V'hainam lishmo korban. And this is called a korban, and therefore this is included. Now the Gemara tells us, okay, where's Rav Chisda get this from? It seems against what we learned until now. Kitanai, this is actually a machloket tanaim, and he holds by one side, and until now we were learning the other side of this debate. Rabbi Elazar omer kol shemimenu liishim. Rabbi Elazar specifically says, only if it went on the fire part of it are you forbidden to burn the rest of it. Rabbi Akiva omer kol sheshmo korban. Okay, he says no, anything called a korban. My binai, what's the nafkamina between them? Okay, so now we have to come up with what other cases are there. So obviously chatat ha'of is one. Okay, that's what we're going to say right now. Amar Rav Chisda, not surprising, he's the one who just said this. Basar chatat ha'of ika benayu. Okay, the meat of the chatat ha'of would be a good example because nothing of it gets burned. And Rabbi Akiva would say it's prohibited. Rabbi Elazar would say it's not, because nothing of it gets burned. Rav Amar, log shemen shel mitzora ikabenayu. Rav says also the log shemen. Okay, let's remind ourselves of the log shemen. The Kohen takes a log of oil, right? Then he measures it out. This is for the leper. Then he puts into the hand of a different Kohen, right? We have one with the log. He puts into the hand of another Kohen. Some, right? The Kohen puts a handful of the oil. He takes it, he goes to the parochet in the heichal, he sprinkles it 7 times, then he goes out and he puts it on the ear, the finger, and the toe of the leper. Then he takes the rest of it, he sticks it on the head of the leper, remember? And then whatever's left in the original measuring utensil goes to the kohanim. Now, you would have to say this is called a korban, okay? So we'll get to that in 1 minute. But what we're saying is that log of oil that's left that goes to the kohanim, if you offer it, that would be a nafkamina between these two opinions. Why? Because Ditani Levi, as Levi says, kol korbanam l'rabot log shemen shel mitzorah. This is a different pasuk. How do we know that the log shemen goes to the kohen? I told you this, right? The log shemen goes to the kohen. How do we know? From this pasuk we're going to read right now. Bamidbar Yutet, verse 9. This will be for the kohanim. You're going to get all these gifts from the high sanctity offerings. Mina esh kol korbanam l'chol menchatam u'l'chol chatatam u'l'chol hashamam asher yashivu li kodesh kodeshim l'chau levanecha. So you're going to get from all the korbanot, from all the menachot, from all the chataot, from all the ashamot. Now, why does it say kol korbanam? Right? It seems to say a lot of words that are a little bit redundant. Kol korbanam comes to include something additional that's not a chatat, asham, which is usually the meat the kohen gets, right? Because the ola gets burned completely, the shlemin gets eaten by the owner. So it's specifically those. But what is kol korbanam? According to Levi, that includes the log shemen shel mitzorah. He says that includes the log shemen. What do you see here? The word korbanan relates to the log, even though you wouldn't necessarily thought we'd call that a korban, but it's called a korban. And there you have. That goes to prove Rav that besides the basar chatat ha'of, there would be a nafkamina between this machloket if it wasn't burned. Part of it wasn't burned, the rest of it is it forbidden, right? If none of it was burned, that would include the log of the mitzorah, and in addition, what Rav Chisda said, the basar of chatat, okay, the meat of the chatat of a bird offering. Okay, so that was sugya number 2, which is a new understanding that we didn't see until now about that prohibition of kol shemimenu liishim. It's really not just liishim, according to some. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're back to this. I told you we get back here at the end of the daf, which is, I know we're only at the end of Amud Aleph, but you'll see Amud Bet is very short. To this idea of kol. What is before we said, why do you need kol seor and kol dvash? But the question is, why do you need kol at all, right? And that they kind of didn't tell you yet, and now we're going to see that. What we darshan from the word kol by seor and kol by dvash. So, okay, why we need it in each case, that we already resolved. But why do we need it at all is what this braita comes to tell us. Tanu Rabbanan. The braita says, the rabbis learned, seor. Okay, it should be bal. It says bal taktiru. It should be lo taktiru. Okay, it's going to keep saying bal, but bal means don't. But the pasuk actually says lo taktiru. Right, that's the pasuk. Kol seor v'chol dvash lo taktiru. That's the pasuk we're talking about. So seor lo taktiru and li ela kulo. Right, when it says in the pasuk leaven, don't burn. Okay, that means the whole leaven. Meaning, okay, let's say you're going to take. We don't know what a whole shear is. Okay, we're going to have a debate about this, but the whole amount. Let's say a kometz or something like that, or a kazayit. That's going to be our debate. Miktsato minayin. How do you know that I'm liable even if I do less than the requisite amount? Talmud lomar kol. That's what the word kol is coming to include. Second part of the braita, eruvo minayin. How do you know if it's mixed up in something, right? With the Gemara, in general, the Mishnah Gemara, they love talking about tarova. This got mixed up with that. Rashi says we're talking about if you have matzah and a little bit of leavening got in there, a leavening agent, and nobody knew about, like Rashi says it's lo minkar, you can't even recognize it. Okay, in a non-recognizable way because it's mixed up in something else. How do you know that if you offer that on the altar, you're also liable? Talmud lomar, ki kol. Okay, ki. It says ki kol seor vidva kol dvash lo taktir. Should have just said, right? Kol menchashesh krivu laHashem lo teaseh chametz. Don't make a chametz. Kol seor v'chol dvash lo taktiru. Should have said, don't burn any seor, any dvash. But instead, it says because. So what did that word because add? Oh, it adds, even though the word because doesn't really add that, but it adds something additional. What must that be? A mixture. Whether it's a mixture of honey mixed in with something or chametz mixed in with something. So now we're going to have a machloket Abaye and Rava, what the shear is that's mentioned in the first part of the braita. So Abaye Amar Abaye, Hachi Kamar. Oh, sorry, my Kamar. I forgot to read that. My Kamar, what does it mean? What does it mean when it says miktsato? What is miktsato? Part of what? Like how much? Okay, so Amar Abaye, Hachi Kamar. This is the way to read it. Okay, now he rereads the braita with his reading. Se'or lo taktiru, and li'ela kazayit. Okay, he says we're talking about a kazayit, meaning the regular forbidden amount should be a kazayit, which is usually the amount of food that's forbidden in general, or an olive bulk. Chatzi zayit minayin, so the kol must be coming to include, what about half a zayit? Talmud lamar kol. Okay, that's what the kol is coming to include, even half a shear of an olive is half an olive. A ruvo, remember, we're just talking about the size of an olive, not an actual olive. A ruvo minayin, now he's just quoting the second part, which says the same thing, as the braita says, Talmud lomar ki kol. Okay, Rava Amar. Rava says, no, it's not zayit and chatzi zayit. He's going to say kometz and chatzi kometz. Handful, because that's the shear that you normally burn on the altar, a handful. So it's a handful and a half a handful. Okay, so let's read that inside. Hachi kamar. Or lo taktiru and li'ela kometz. Chatzi kometz minayin, Talmud lomar kol. And then eruvo minayin, Talmud lomar ki kol, that's the same. Now they say, b'mai kami palge. What's the root of their debate? Why does Abaye say kazayit and why does Rava say kometz? Okay, Abaye will be a little more understandable once you see Rava, but we're going to start with Abaye because the Gemara starts with it. Abaye sever yesh kometz pachot mishnei zeitim. This is actually a machloket. We saw it back on Daf Kafav. You can do a kometz. A kometz can be less than 2 olive bulks. V'yesh haktara pchuta mikazayit. He says the following. Theoretically, a kometz, which is the shear of that you need to burn things on the altar, and then therefore that would be the shear to forbid, could be theoretically less than 2 olive bulks. If it could be less than 2 olive bulks, then if you're going to say, well, half of that, right, half of a requisite amount, half of it is going to get you to less than a kazayit, right? Because half of less than 2 olive bulks, the assumption is kol is kind of dropping things down in half. And so you have to say, number one, a kometz could be less than 2 zaytim, and that's how we could get down to under less than a kazayit, you'll be chayav also. And then, because again, kol is just coming to say half of that. What's that? Well, what's the regular amount of things you burn? Could be less than 2 zaytim. So you could get down less than a kazayit. And you have to say, what does it mean, yesh haktara pchuta mikazayit? There's halachic significance to a burning that's less than a kazayit. What does that mean? We've seen this before. That means, for example, if I burn something outside, remember I'm supposed to burn everything inside. What if I take a kometz and I burn it outside, but I took less than a kazayit of it? Is that significant or not that I'll be liable? According to Abaye, that's significant enough. In other words, if even less than a kazayit, if I burn it outside, I could be liable. Rava, we're going to see, doesn't hold that way. And that's why Rava can't say that kol would include half a zayit, because he doesn't think that there's a burning that's significant halachically that's less than a kazayit. And therefore you're not going to be liable if I burn something I'm not supposed to burn, right? Just like I wouldn't be liable if I burnt it outside the temple, I won't be liable if I'm not allowed to burn it and I burn it inside the temple. So that's why Abaye, it makes a little more sense with Rava, because Rava can't say that, and therefore he says something else. Since Abaye can say it, that's what he says. So Rava Amar, ein kometz pachot mishnei zeitim, ve'ein haktara pchuta mikazayit. He holds that we're at the top of Amud Bet now. Rava says, ein kometz pachot mishnei zeitim. There's no such thing as a kometz less than shnei zeitim. So first of all, if you're going to say half of that, well, half of the regular amount that you normally burn would be still a kazayit. So he wouldn't get under kazayit. And also, he holds that ein haktara pchuta mikazayit. Even if you'd say maybe kol comes to include, a quarter even of the shear, but there is no halachic significance, according to Rava, to a burning that's less than a kazayit. So if you burn less than a kazayit, you're not going to be chayav. And that's why he doesn't think that kol comes to include half a kazayit. So it must include half a kometz. Now, half a kometz, since kometz has to be 2 zaytim, half a kometz has to be at least a kazayit. And then it fits perfectly with his opinion. Okay. With this, we're going to finish with one last machloket. And that will bring us to the next Mishnah. And the end of our daf. Hama'aleh miseor umidvash al gabei hamizbech. Now, what did we just learn? Based on this braita that we just learned, we have kol se'or comes to include, right, less than a shear, which again, less than a kometz or less than a kazayit, depending whether you're Abaye and Rav. Ki kol came to include a ta'arovet. So now this pasuk, I just want to point out what we've done to this pasuk. Okay, this is the review of what we've done. So, we spent a long time at the beginning of that pasuk. This is all about a mincha and the mincha itself, not just the kometz, and even the shirayim also, and all that. Okay, the mincha asher tekrivu can't be chametz. Ki kol seor v'chol dvash lo taktiru mimenu ishal Hashem. We now have a lot of prohibitions in this pasuk. Number 1, you can't burn seor on the mizbech. Number 2, you can't burn dvash on the mizbech. Number 3, you can't burn something that part of it was burned on the altar. You can't burn the other part. Now we learn also from this last braita, we learn a mixture with honey or a mixture with a leaven, something leavened, also can't be offered. So that's already 5 things we're learning from this one pasuk. From this one prohibition, lo taktiru. So comes Rav and he says, so now we have this case. What if you put on the altar some seor and some dvash, a combination of seor and dvash? Amar Rava, lo kemishum seor, v'lo kemishum dvash, v'lo kemishum eruvei seor, u'mishum eruvei dvash. He says, okay, you're not with the lo taktiru mimenu ishel Hashem. That part you don't have, right? The kosher mimenu li'ishin. But you have 4 other prohibitions. You put seor, you put dvash, you put a mixture of dvash, you put a mixture of seor. 4 negative prohibitions. Now, some people say there's a big debate, and that's why this is such a short daf, because there's a lot of Tosfots on this daf. There's a lot of things that are unclear here. Whether we're talking specifically where maybe you needed also to have a little bit of seor, a little bit of dvash, and a combo, okay, perhaps, and a combo of the 2, and then you'd be liable for, or maybe even just with a combo, it includes also the seor, also the dvash, also the combo, also the combo with honey, and also the combo with leaven. Anyway, it's a bit of a debate what exactly, but we could just assume one of those cases, okay? You could theoretically be obligated 4 sets of lashes. Abai Amal, ein lokin alav shebechlalot. He says, what are you talking about? This is a classic example of a lav shebechlalot. Now, it's a little hard to say classic example because lav shebechlalot is a term that's used in different places in different ways. So, and here's a good debate about it we're going to see in 1 minute, and that's where we're going to end our daf about how to understand this. But lav shebechlalot is generally a pasuk where it means a number of different prohibitions. What better pasuk than our pasuk, right? There's another pasuk, lo tuchlu al adam, which has about 5 different interpretations of what it could mean. Okay, like one of them is don't eat the meat till you put the blood on the altar. Okay, there's a bunch of different prohibitions. And the assumption is that since this one negative prohibition, this one word, don't do this, but it means possibly, right? Not even possibly, it means all these things at the same time. So that's called a general, klalot means general. It's a general negative prohibition that since it doesn't specify, we'll see in a minute where they get this from, one particular prohibition, you don't get lashes at all. Okay? So, Ika de Amri, some people understood Abaye to be saying, Chadami alake, no, you are going to get at least 1 set. Meaning, okay, what does it mean? Well, now this is a little different from Lo Tuchlu al Adam. Lo Tuchlu al Adam is the simple reading of these, right? This one pasuk is multiple prohibitions. In our pasuk, we have what it says specifically. Don't eat seor, don't eat dvash. But then we say, well, besides that, the word ki comes to include also a mixture. So some people read Abai as saying, you're going to get lashes because you put seor on the altar, and you're going to get lashes because you put honey on the altar. Those are clearly 2 separate prohibitions. Even though there's only one word, lo taktiru, but the lo taktiru is don't burn this, don't burn that. For sure you're going to get lashes for each of those. The ta'arovet, which is the added, you're not going to get lashes for. And then lav shebechalot here means something a little different. It means like when there's a drasha to include more prohibitions of this prohibition, those you're not going to get lashes on. But ika da amre chadanami lo lake daha lo miyached lave kelav de chasima. Here's the root of the halacha. But before we get there, let's just read the words. Some people say that even 1 you don't get. You don't even get 1 set of lashes here. And that's more like the lav shebechalot of lo tuchlu al adam. Because this pasuk means so many things at once that means there's no prohibition. Why? Because lo miyached lave, it doesn't have a specific prohibition like the lav of chasima. Lo tachsom shor b'disho means don't muzzle your ox while it's threshing. Okay, you can't forbid the ox. It's torture to the ox to not let it eat while it's threshing. So why is this the classic paradigmatic example? Because it's juxtaposed to the pasuk about lashes. So they say this pasuk shows when you get lashes. First of all, it's a lav with a maaseh, right? With an action, as opposed to we learned lav she'en bo ma'aseh, and most people say ein lokin alav, you don't get lashes. And it's a specific, unique one action, not something that includes multiple prohibitions. In which case, according to this explanation, Abaye would say you don't get lashes at all. Okay, so that's the debate within Rav and Abaye, and then the debate within Abaye, does he mean no lashes at all, or does he mean lashes for or lashes for drasha, but not for the fact that there's a combo of them. Okay, you already are going to get the lashes for each of them, not going to get for the combo, okay, for the ta'arovet. And then again, I told you, it was a little bit of a debate about what exactly the case is. There's a lot of things here, like I said, that there's different opinions about. Okay, so let's review our daf. We started with Rabbi Yochanan. What does he do with otam? That Rabbi Elazar used it to learn his halacha about your exempt from the other situations of kosher mimenu li'ishim, if you put it on the ramp. He uses otam to say no public shtei alechem voluntary offerings. We brought a braita that seems to say there is, because hutar michalo, what did that mean? And then we said, no, that means the regular shtei alechem, because even though it's not burned on the altar, but it goes with meat that's burned on the altar. What about the bikkurim then, which doesn't have that, and they have the birds? Oh no, the birds are just an added thing. Then we had the question Rami Barchama asked, which in the end comes out to be this machloket tanaim, about is it only kosher mimenu li'ishim, things that went on the fire, or anything that's not supposed to be run on the altar that's called a korban. That included the chatat ha'of, and the bird's sin offering, and the log shemen of the leper, okay, which are called korbanot, but they're not offered. None of it is offered on the altar. According to Rav Chisda, and we saw that was also according to Rabbi Akiva, that would also be part of this prohibition as well. So that was a new way of reading that prohibition that we talked about in the previous page. Then we had the drasha of kol se'or and ki kol. And then we had a drasha about what kol includes mikzato. What is mikzato? Abaye said a zayit, and Rava said it's a kometz, a half a kometz, right? Half a zayit or half a kometz. And that all was based on some other machlok that they have about whether there's haktara less than a kazayit and whether a kometz can be less than 2 zaytim or not. And then we finished with this machloket about how many sets of lashes do you get if you put a combo of se'or and dvash. Can you get up to 4 sets of lashes? Or maybe none at all, or maybe only for se'or and dvash, but not for the combo, depending on how you understand lav shebechalot of Abaye. And with that, we finish for today. I'll just say one more point about lav shebechalot, which I think I made already, but even the commentaries talk about that lav shebechalot is a phrase, and this makes things sometimes confusing for learners. It's a phrase that in different places is used differently. Okay, it's not a phrase that always means the same thing, which makes it confusing because you want to know, well, what is a lav shebechalot? So it somewhat depends on the context. And here's a good example where it's actually a little confusing how to understand it. Okay, what does it even mean? Whereas, as opposed to, sometimes it means one thing, sometimes it means something else. Here it's actually a debate what exactly it means. They're not even sure. So that just makes lav shebechalot a little bit of a confusing term because you can't get a clear-cut definition because it's used in different sugyot in different ways. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day, be a safe day, and Shishma B'Sorot Tova.